So let's take a look at a couple of short stories that I think are very, very interesting and been talked about quite a bit by literary critics, very famous ones. We'll start off with Eudora Welty. Might be a two-video lecture. I'm going to be sprinkling some extra credit nuggets throughout here, okay? So you got to listen carefully if you want to pick up that extra credit. You'll send your extra credit nugget answers to my email no later than the end of the day on Black Friday, right? Okay, so I'll give you a little extra time to do that. Watch these videos and do the reading, but end of the day as in midnight on Black Friday. Not Saturday morning, Friday night. All right, so let's take a look at something you need to know about Eudora Welty's sort of short fiction here. We're doing Petrified Man, which is kind of a weird little tale. This is the thing you got to understand about Welty. One of the great things about Welty is she's really known more for character than she is just about anything else. I think so anyway. She says down there at the lower right, she says, "What I do in the writing of any character is to try to enter into the mind, heart, and skin of a human being who is not myself. It is the act of a writer's imagination that I set the most high." And I think that's true. I mean, knowing people. Writers are about relating people as much as anything else. And certainly that's what we're interested in most in terms of our daily lives is other people. And so having said that, don't overlook the fact that the importance, I should say, of place, because place forms us as people, right? Where we grew up, our neighborhoods, the families that we grew up in, everybody has some interesting characters and people that were informed by where they grew up in. Welty is an early to mid 20th century writer, for the most part, in the American South. And so she's going to be writing about the people that she knew and interacted with in that place and in that particular time in history. And you want to take a close look at how she crafts these characters so that they are able themselves, of course, more often than not, to reveal things about themselves and others. Yes, she uses a third-person narrator, but really it's the voices of the characters themselves that tell you most about them. Okay, that she likes to let you hear those characters. Now, Petrified Man, very simple short story in many respects. First thing we'll start off with is the place, and that is this beauty parlor. If you are from an older generation like me, then you would know that beauty parlors in the South were beehives of social activity. Women would get their hair done a lot. Back in the day. And usually a lot of women in small towns would set up their own beauty parlors. You just went out and got a $5 license. That's about it. No health inspection or anything usually. But back in the day, a woman would convert her garage, or she'd take a bedroom in her house and she would just turn it into a beauty parlor, and she would just do people's hair and just set it all up. Or they might have their own shop. My mother used to get her hair done by a lady down the road named Myrtle. And I remember hanging out in there and playing with things and reading comic books on the floor while my mother had her hair done by Myrtle. And people just did that. And so, but of course it's a place where women got together, and it's where you sort of exchanged information, otherwise known as gossiping. But it's where the town news got spread. And with men, it was the barbershop. Frequently, you'd go in there and you'd talk about all kinds of things and shoot the breeze. And this is how people interacted. They didn't have social media back then. They didn't have the internet or anything like that. They actually ended up talking to each other face to face, which is we kind of missed that a little bit. And so this is this beauty shop, which is where we see Leota and Mrs. Fletcher and all these different people interacting, is a perfect place. It's a perfect location. We talked a little bit about that when we talked about, sitcoms and the little comedy box when we were talking about Revelation by Flannery O'Connor. Well, she's using the sort of same thing. It's a bit of a box where you can see people kind of interacting, and it's a place that is a place where people from the town would come to, right? There's a reason for it. It's an easy reason, or an easy place to set up so that you would guarantee to see lots of interaction among townspeople. She's looking at primarily working class white Southerners. There are a lot of derogatory names for working class white Southerners: hillbillies, rednecks, white trash, whatever. And I don't think she looks down on them the way maybe some people might. I think in this case, she kind of looks at them as sources of humor, people that you run into and and yeah, kind of laugh a little bit if you want. The dialogue in the story really is key, though, okay? And we want to take a look at the dialogue. We want to look at Billy Boy's parting line, especially because it's a fairly famous parting line. But we also want to look at the structure. I'm going to move over here by Eudora, okay? There we go. We want to look at the structure. So you have the opening scene really here in the beauty parlor. Then we get a cutaway. Then we get kind of this... the second part of the story where we get the narration of what had happened during the cutaway, right? Something transpired between the first day we see them in the beauty parlor and then the follow-up, okay? So there's this gap of time in between and we find out what's going on. And we get to see Leota and Mrs. Pike Leota talking about Mrs. Pike being this new friend she has, and then something happens. Ms. Pike ain't such a good friend no more, right? And we find out why. Now, and then the setting, etc. And especially we want to listen to Leota's voice, which is the dominant voice in the piece. So this is really a sketch about Leota and the Leotas of the world, if you wish to see that. So in essence, the story involves Leota, who's working at the hair salon, etc. She's dealing with Mrs. Fletcher, and she's kind of telling them, and they're about this new woman named Miss Pike that's come into town, and she's just really hit it off with Miss Pike, right? She's good friends with Miss Pike and all this kind of stuff. You ever met somebody who you've been friends with them for a long time, and then they somehow find this new friend, right? And they're just crazy about them, hang out, spend all their time with this new friend. You're like, hey, what happened to us? I thought we were buddies too. I thought we were good friends. All of a sudden, this new friend of yours is all that, And then after a while, maybe a month, 2 months or whatever, suddenly new friend turns out not to be such a good friend. And your friend comes back to you wanting to hang out with you again. You ever seen something like that? It happens a lot in middle school where, the new kid in town, it's, oh, I'm going to hang out with this new kid because she or he's all that fun. And then about a month or two later, you find out you weren't that good a friend, or that person wasn't that good a kid, right? And then they coming back to you saying, I'm going to be my best friend again because that other new best friend not very best friendy anymore. So that's a bit what's going on here. So they like to go out and have a good time and all this kind of stuff. And we find out from early on who Miss Pike is. And the freak show is in town. Now, a lot of people don't know much about freak shows, but back in the day, circuses would come to town and the freak show would be part of it. And you'd have everything from, the rubber band man who was flexible to, little pygmies and freak shows and people who could like stick swords down their throats and, the man, the strong man and bearded ladies and all the, just whatever kind of freaks you could imagine. They would get into these sideshows and you'd pay to get in and see them. Real lowbrow entertainment, let me tell you. And then you go to see the rest of the circus and all this kind of stuff. Well, the kind of person who would go to a freak show really isn't the kind of person who's like into Shakespeare, okay? Be nice about it. That tells you a little bit about Leota. But she goes on about how she and Mrs. Pike had gone to the freak show. And she's telling Mrs. Fletcher. And Mrs. Fletcher is pregnant, right? We don't tell anybody that somebody's pregnant back in the day. You didn't say that out loud. Nice ladies, I guess, didn't get pregnant. They just showed up 9 months later after the stork had arrived. I don't know. But some people back in the day were rather sensitive about it. And part of it had to do with their appearance and all this kind of stuff. They don't want to appear to be pregnant. They want to look, like perfectly, they don't want to be puffy or have swollen ankles or any of that kind of thing, even though it's perfectly natural. But a nice, respectable upper middle class lady simply wouldn't let people know about that. That's very personal and all this kind of thing. Okay. So Mrs. Fletcher, and again, the story is a lot about class distinction, right? Mrs. Fletcher fancies herself at least half a notch, if not a full notch, above Leota. Okay, she goes to Leota to get her hair done. She doesn't go to Leota because she and Leota hang out and drink cheap beer together. So Mrs. Fletcher is constantly sort of dropping these, I don't go to freak shows. My husband and I are respectable kind of thing, right? So you see this class conflict in here, and we'll get into it in just a moment. It's also this sense of loss, that we'll talk about in a sort of a crazy upside down outcome here. But let's take a look at some of the dialogue because it's kind of interesting. It's more than interesting. It's really funny. And what you have to do is you really kind of have to transport yourself and kind of hear the voice of the character in your head while you're reading. So here's Leota describing to Mrs. Fletcher while she's doing her hair. describing to Mrs. Fletcher the fact that she and Mrs. Pike went to the freak show. So she talks about, you ain't ever been? You Miss Fletcher, you ever been to the freak show? You ain't ever been? She says, no, I despise freaks, declared Mrs. Fletcher. Well, well, honey, talking about being pregnant and all, you ought to see these little twins in a bottle. You really owe it to yourself. What twins? Asked Mrs. Fletcher out of the side of her mouth. Well, honey, they got these two twins in a bottle, see? Born joined plumb together. Dead, of course. Leota dropped her voice into a soft, lyrical hum. They was about this long. Pardon, must have been full time, all right. Wouldn't you say? And they had these two little heads and these two faces and two on 4 arms and 4 legs all kind of joined here. Well, see, this face looked this way and that other face looked that away. Over the shoulder, see, kind of pathetic. Glaw, Mrs. Fletcher said disapprovingly. Well, ugly. Honey, I mean to tell you, their parents was first cousins and all like that. Billy boy, get me a fresh towel from that teeny stack. This one here is wringing wet. And quit tickling my ankles with that curler. Me and Mr. Fletcher aren't one speck of kin. Or you, as though people do. Like these two twins, they had them preserved in a bottle, and they was like joined together, and they must have been, their parents must have been cousins. Mrs. Fletcher, me and Mr. Fletcher are not related at all, right? Well, nobody accused you of being cousins. Why are you so defensive, Mrs. Fletcher? Nevertheless, of course not. Neither's me and Fred that we know of. Anyway, well, honey, what Mrs. Pike liked was the pygmies. At the freak show, that is. They got these pygmies down there, too, and Miss Pike was just wild about them. The teeniest men in the universe. Well, honey, they just rest back on their little bohunkus and roll around, and you can't hardly tell if they're sitting or standing. That'll give you some idea. They're about 42 years old. Just suppose it was with your husband. Right? Just suppose it was your husband. What if you married somebody like that? As though you accidentally marry pygmies, or conjoin twins or something, right? So Leota has this strange notion of, well, I seen this freaky little thing, and it was strange, and ooh, what if you was married to him? What? Wouldn't that be weird? Mrs. Fletcher's like, I wouldn't marry a man like that. And her response, of course, is, well, Mr. Fletcher is 5'9" and 1/2. He's no pygmy. He's a perfectly normal-sized man. Fred's 5'10". But I tell him he's a shrimp on account of I'm so tall. He says I wouldn't care for that. What does Mrs. Pike see in them, these pygmies? Well, I don't know. She's just cute, that's all. They got this man, this petrified man, that everything ever since he was 9 years old, when it goes down in his digestion, see, somehow Miss Pike says it goes to his joints and it turns him to stone. So he eats something and it makes him go stiff, right? And he becomes a petrified man, right? She was just fascinated. So she goes on and on about this freak show, and it's fun to hear. You're thinking, where is this story going? Well, the answer is it's not really going anywhere. She's just enjoying the voice of Leota as you hear her in your head. And if there's anybody you've ever met that's kind of like Leota, you instantly identify and say, yep, I know somebody like that, who really goes off on a tangent and really can tell a wild tale. You never know what else they're going to bring up. And of course she goes on and on. And what we see is that there's a break in the story. And we find out later, scene 2, Mrs. Pike is not such a hot friend anymore. And the reason for that is because, well, there's a story. Come to find out, Mrs. Pike and her husband are being put up by Leota's acquaintance or friend or relative or what have you. And in the apartment where they're staying, they see a G-Man magazine, right? A G-Man magazine in the back with a wanted picture of a guy who looks just like the Petrified Man. And Leota misses out on the opportunity for a reward. Mrs. Pike gets it, takes the money, doesn't share it, even though it was her magazine. Okay? And, of course, that makes a falling out between the two of them. And she has to relate all that, again, to the folks in the salon. And at the very end, she's fussing and moaning and groaning about this lack of justice, right? It's unfair. This woman that I befriended and I took in and I helped and we even bought them beer, and she sees one of my magazines, and then she takes the reward for noticing that the petrified man was this murdering rapist or what have you, and she gets all the reward and doesn't share any of it. What an ungrateful person that is. And at the end, we see Billy Boy, who's this kind of weird brat character who's constantly fussing around into things, fiddling around with things in purses and on the floor and everything. And she finally has enough of him and kind of chews him out. And at the very, very end of the short story, it says, Billy Boy stomped through the group of wild-haired ladies and went out of the door, but flung back the words, "If you're so smart, why ain't you rich?" And the story ends, right? Which is an interesting question. If you're so smart, why ain't you rich? Evidently, Mrs. Pike was smarter than you because she got the reward and you didn't get it, right? But then again, it's a terribly unjust question. Just because you're smart doesn't mean you need to be rich. Just because you're rich doesn't mean you're necessarily smart. There's not necessarily a connection between the two. Plenty of rich people who are stupid, plenty of smart people who aren't rich. But the boy seems to think, well, if you're so smart, how come you ain't rich? Where'd he get that from? I bet he got it from Miss Pike, didn't he? So that's the kind of person who thinks, well, smart equals smart enough to get money, and that's all smart needs to be. But that's our question there, or that's our story there. With I'm not being well spoken tonight on our lecture. I'm sorry, but that's our introduction to the slice of life, is what it is. It's like, take a look at these people. She gives you the smells of the beauty parlor, all the powders and the hairspray. You ever been into a beauty parlor that's just you can't breathe almost because of all the stuff floating around in the air? It's probably terribly bad for you, coating your lungs with Lord knows what. All the permanent and all the chemicals and crud in the hair and everything. And by the way, Welty happens to be white. She's living in the mostly segregated South, and so her characters are white, and she's kind of making fun of the characters that she saw and knew, the white characters. You could easily do this, very easily do this, if you were African American or Hispanic, and just draw the same kind of funny picture of taking one character that you say, there's this lady I grew up with. I'm telling you what, she was a talker. And put them in a beauty shop and let them go. And you could see it with almost any culture. It's just human nature. So just because this is a white lady in the white South doesn't mean that there's not something universal going on here. You could be any color and decide to write a story like this with the kind of interesting people, and particularly Leota in almost any ethnicity, and it'd be a lot of fun. All right, so end of our first video. I'm gonna ask you to send me the first two nuggets. One, how does Mrs. Pike find out who the petrified man is? Where does she see it? What does she find out? Second thing is, what is Mrs. Fletcher's, what is Leota's husband's name? What's his name? What's Leota's husband's name? Okay. Send those two to me. There'll be two more in the next video.